It wasn't the refusal itself that shook the palace, it was the silence that followed. When Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, chose not to bow to Queen Camilla during a private royal moment, insiders didn't just notice, they froze. Because in a family built on protocol, silence like that only means one thing. A line has been crossed, and it cannot be undone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in that brief, almost imperceptible pause was not loud, not explosive, not even acknowledged in real time, and yet, according to those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy, it triggered an immediate and unmistakable ripple of alarm behind closed doors. This was not how things were supposed to happen. Every gesture within royal life is measured, rehearsed, and understood long before it is ever performed, which is why this moment, so quiet on the surface, carried a weight that insiders reportedly described as highly irregular. It wasn't just the absence of a curtsy, it was the presence of intention. Sophie, long known for her composure and unwavering adherence to duty, did not appear flustered or caught off guard. Quite the opposite. Her stillness, her calm, and the precision of her choice drew attention precisely because it lacked hesitation. And that's where the tension began to thicken. Because across from her stood a queen whose authority, while formally established, has always existed within a delicate and often scrutinized balance of acceptance and legacy. Observers suggest that Queen Camilla's reaction in that moment was controlled, but telling tight, restrained, and perhaps edged with something deeper than surprise. It was not a confrontation, not openly. But within the rigid codes of royal behavior, it didn't need to be. These are signals understood without words, messages delivered through absence rather than action. And as whispers began to circulate, among aides and long-serving staff, a quiet consensus started to form. This was not spontaneous. It could not have been. Because for someone like Sophie, whose entire public life has been defined by discipline and respect for the institution, to deviate even slightly suggests something far more significant beneath the surface. Something that had been building. Something that had reached a point where silence itself became the only statement left to make. And as those whispers grew louder behind the palace walls, one unsettling idea began to take hold. This wasn't the beginning of a story. It was the breaking point of one that had been unfolding in secret for far longer than anyone had realized. But what looked like a quiet breach of protocol was, in reality, the final move in a much deeper and far more personal royal conflict. Long before this moment, the rules were already written, and so were the tensions. Within the rigid hierarchy of the monarchy, every bow, every gesture carries centuries of meaning. But what happens when one royal decides those rules no longer apply? To understand the weight of what unfolded, you have to step into a system where nothing is accidental, where even the smallest movement is rooted in a code that stretches back generations, shaped by duty, discipline, and an unspoken agreement that the institution must always come before the individual. A curtsy, to the outside world, may appear ceremonial, almost symbolic, but within royal life, it is something far more serious. It is acknowledgement, alignment, and in many ways, submission to a structure that defines who stands where and why. And for someone like Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, this structure was never questioned. For decades, she has been seen as one of the most dependable figures within the monarchy, someone who understood the rules not just as obligations, but as part of a larger responsibility to uphold stability. Her loyalty was not loud, not performative, but it was insistent, which is exactly why this moment feels so unsettling. Because when someone who has always followed the script suddenly steps outside of it, even briefly, it forces a deeper question: what changed? At the same time, the rise of Queen Camilla has not been without its own quiet complexities. Her position, though now firmly established, has evolved through years of shifting public perception and internal adjustment, moving from a controversial presence to a central figure within the firm. But authority, especially in a system built on legacy, is not just granted, it is absorbed, tested, and, at times, resisted in ways that are never openly discussed. And it is in that quiet resistance that tensions often begin to form. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II marked more than the end of an era. It subtly altered the emotional and structural balance within the monarchy. The figure who once embodied unquestioned authority was no longer there to anchor every interaction. And in her absence, new dynamics began to surface. Relationships shifted, influence recalibrated. And those who had long operated within a clearly defined order suddenly found themselves navigating something less certain, something still taking shape. Observers have pointed to this period as a turning point, a moment when the lines between tradition and adaptation began to blur, creating space for underlying divisions to emerge. Not openly, not dramatically, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. Conversations became more careful, positions more deliberate. And within that evolving landscape, the idea of a changing balance of power started to take hold, not as a declaration, but as a quiet understanding shared among those who watch closely. Because when authority is in transition, even the smallest actions begin to carry greater meaning. And what once would have been dismissed as routine suddenly becomes significant. So when Sophie made her choice, it did not exist in isolation, it landed in a moment. Already charged with subtle tension, shaped by years of unspoken shifts and carefully managed perceptions. And that is why this moment matters. Not because it broke a rule, but because it revealed something deeper, a shift that had been building quietly beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to surface in a way that could no longer be ignored. And it's within that shifting balance that Sophie's decision begins to look less like defiance and more like a calculated stand. It happened in seconds, but those seconds are now being replayed in royal circles like a breaking headline. No curtsy, no acknowledgement, just a pause and a message that couldn't be ignored. What makes this moment so unsettling is not what was done, but how precisely it was done. According to those who closely observe royal protocol, there is always a rhythm to these interactions, an almost instinctive sequence that unfolds without hesitation. And yet, when Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, stepped into that moment, something shifted. The expected gesture never arrived. Instead, there was stillness, measured, deliberate, and impossible to misinterpret for those who understand the language of the monarchy. Insiders have since tried to reconstruct those few seconds with remarkable intensity. Not because they were dramatic on the surface, but because of what they revealed underneath. Sophie's posture remained composed, her expression controlled, her timing exact. There was no sign of confusion, no indication that this was accidental or overlooked. And that is where the tension began to tighten, because in a system where every movement is rehearsed through years of discipline, deviation carries intention. Across from her, Queen Camilla was, by several accounts, momentarily caught off guard. Not in a way that erupted outwardly, but in a way that registered internally, a brief disruption in what should have been routine. Observers familiar with these dynamics describe her reaction as contained, unmistakably affected, a subtle tightening that suggested awareness of what had just occurred without acknowledging it openly. And then came the silence. Not the kind of silence that fills a room naturally, but the kind that presses in, that lingers just long enough to signal that something has gone off script. Witnesses later described it as heavy, a pause that seemed to stretch beyond its actual length because of the meaning it carried. No one spoke, no one intervened, because in that moment, there was nothing to correct, only something to absorb. Almost immediately, efforts were reportedly made to smooth over what had happened. Within palace structures, moments like these are often managed quietly, reframed before they can take on a life of their own. But this time, the containment didn't fully hold. Whispers began to move through internal channels, not loudly, not officially, but steadily. Staff who had seen it began to share interpretations. Others, who hadn't heard about it, began asking questions. And with each retelling, the same conclusion kept surfacing: this was not a mistake. It was too precise, too controlled, too intentional to be dismissed. Speculation grew, not in public at first, but within the very environment designed to suppress it. Because when something disrupts the expected order so cleanly, it forces those within the system to reconsider what they thought they understood. And that is what made these seconds so powerful. They didn't just break a pattern, they exposed one. A pattern of tension, of unspoken disagreements, of pressures that had been building beneath the surface long before this moment ever arrived. And as those whispers continued to spread, one idea began to take hold with increasing certainty: this was not about etiquette, and it was never meant to be. It was a signal, a controlled, deliberate signal that something deeper had shifted. But insiders insist this wasn't about a single moment, it was about something that had been building quietly for years. Behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with loyalty, legacy, and trust. Because what appeared, on the surface, to be a quiet deviation from protocol begins to take on an entirely different meaning when placed against the backdrop of decisions that, according to persistent whispers within royal circles, have been reshaping relationships for some time. Reports suggest that tensions had been building not around public appearances, but around internal discussions, those carefully guarded exchanges where influence is measured, advice is weighed, and the future direction of the institution is quietly debated. And within those spaces, figures like Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, have long been viewed as steady, grounded voices. Aligned closely with what many describe as the Old Guard, a group deeply committed to preserving the traditional framework of the monarchy. This alignment was never about resistance for the sake of it. It was about continuity, about protecting a structure that has, for generations, relied on discipline over disruption. But as the internal landscape evolved, so too did the balance of influence, and not everyone adapted to those changes in the same way. The rise of Queen Camilla into a more central and authoritative role, while formally acknowledged, has reportedly come with its own set of complexities behind the scenes. Various interpretations suggest that disagreements began to surface not openly, not in ways that would ever reach public view, but in the subtle shifts of who was heard, who was consulted, and who, over time, found their voice carrying less weight than before. For someone like Sophie, whose contributions have often been described as consistent yet understated, the idea of being sidelined, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of changing dynamics, carries a quiet but significant impact. Insiders whisper of conversations where perspectives once valued began to feel overlooked, of moments where long-standing experience was met with a different kind of decision-making approach. One that did not always align with the traditions she had spent years upholding. And it is within these accounts, fragmented yet persistent, that the idea of a breaking point begins to emerge. Not a sudden rupture, not an explosive confrontation, but a gradual realization that something fundamental had shifted. That loyalty, once assumed to be reciprocal, had become more complicated. That trust, once implicit, now required reassessment. And when that realization settles in, it does not always lead to loud reactions. Sometimes, it leads to silence. Sometimes it leads to a single, controlled moment where everything that has been building beneath the surface is expressed not through words, but through absence. That is why this refusal is increasingly being framed not as rebellion, but as protest, a silent, deliberate assertion of position within a system that rarely allows for open dissent. It was not about rejecting authority outright. It was about signaling that something deeper had been disrupted, something that could no longer be ignored or quietly absorbed. And for those watching closely, for those piecing together the fragments of what has been unfolding behind closed doors, that signal was unmistakable. Because when someone so closely associated with stability chooses to step, even briefly, outside of expectation, it forces a reckoning not just with the moment itself, but with everything that led to it. And once that silent protest was made, the ripple effects began to spread far beyond that single room. What followed wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Conversations shifted, alliances tightened, and within days the palace began quietly adjusting to a reality it hadn't expected. The moment itself may have passed without public acknowledgement, but inside the institution, it refused to fade. According to those familiar with internal processes, briefings began almost immediately, not in dramatic gatherings but in measured, carefully controlled conversations among senior figures who understood exactly what had taken place. This was not treated as a misunderstanding. It was treated as a signal. And once that signal was recognized, the response was not chaos, it was recalibration. Lines that had once seemed blurred began to sharpen. Positions that had been quietly evolving started to reveal themselves more clearly, and what had once been subtle differences in perspective began to feel like something more defined. observers suggest that divisions, long managed beneath the surface, became harder to ignore. Not because anyone openly declared them, but because the atmosphere itself began to change. There was a growing sense that the balance within the monarchy was shifting, not dramatically, but decisively. At the center of this quiet realignment stood figures whose roles now carried added weight. Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, often described as steady and deliberate, found his position layered with new complexity. His proximity to both tradition and evolving leadership placed him in a space where neutrality was no longer simple, and every perceived alignment carried meaning. At the same time, attention subtly turned toward Prince William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose approach has often been associated with continuity and adherence to established values. Without any direct statements, without any visible declarations, they became quietly linked to what many interpret as the traditionalist perspective, a camp that prioritizes structure, discipline, and the preservation of long-standing norms. And as these associations took shape, so too did the response from those closer to Queen Camilla. Reports suggest a growing sense of concern within her circle, not expressed publicly, but reflected in the careful management of appearances, in the subtle adjustments to messaging, and in the awareness that perception, once shifted, is difficult to control. Because in an institution where image and unity are paramount, even the suggestion of internal tension carries weight. And it didn't take long for that weight to begin pressing outward. The media, always attuned to nuance, began picking up on what many described as coded signals, small changes in tone, in presence, in the way certain interactions were framed, or in some cases, avoided altogether. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be pointed to directly, but enough to suggest that something beneath the surface was no longer entirely contained. And that is how these moments evolve, not through declarations, but through accumulation. A shift here, a pause there, a pattern that once noticed becomes impossible to unsee. What started as silence was now becoming something else, a quiet but unmistakable reordering of relationships, influence, and perception within one of the most structured institutions in the world. And as that reordering continued to unfold, one question began to rise above all others, pressing against the carefully maintained calm of the palace itself. But the most critical question remained unanswered: how would the king respond? At the center of it all stood a king already under pressure, torn between loyalty, legacy, and a growing divide he could no longer ignore. When news of the moment reached King Charles III, it did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as something quieter, heavier, an issue that could not be dismissed, yet could not be openly addressed without consequence. Reports suggest he was briefed in the same measured tone reserved for matters that carry both personal and institutional weight. The kind of update that forces reflection rather than reaction. Because this was never just about a gesture. It was about what that gesture represented, and more importantly, what it revealed about the shifting dynamics within his own family. For a monarch, the challenge is never simply to lead, it is to balance. And in this moment, that balance became increasingly fragile. On one side stood loyalty to his wife, Queen Camilla, whose position within the monarchy has been carefully established over time, strengthened through persistence and public acceptance. On the other side stood the quiet but significant stance taken by Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, a figure long associated with stability, discretion, and unwavering commitment to royal duty. To favor one interpretation risked undermining the other, and to ignore it altogether risked allowing tension to deepen unchecked. And all of this unfolded under the shadow of something far more personal: his own health. With ongoing concerns already placing strain on his capacity to manage the demands of leadership, the urgency of maintaining internal stability has only intensified. Because in times of uncertainty, even small fractures can widen quickly. The monarchy, built as it is on the perception of unity, cannot afford visible division. Insiders describe the situation as deeply uncomfortable, not because it erupted into open conflict, but because it lingered in that unresolved space where decisions carry consequences no matter which direction they take. History, too, casts a long shadow over moments like this. The monarchy has faced internal divisions before, periods where personal relationships collided with public duty, where the line between family and institution blurred in ways that left lasting marks. And it is in those echoes of the past that the present situation gains even more weight, because the lesson has always been the same. What happens behind closed doors does not stay there forever. It shapes perception, it influences trust, and eventually it finds its way into the narrative that defines the institution itself. For the king, this is not simply a matter to be resolved quietly and moved past. It is a moment that demands careful judgment, one that requires him to navigate not just personalities, but principles, to preserve unity without dismissing truth, to protect the institution without alienating those who uphold it. And as he weighs these competing pressures, the silence that followed Sophie's decision begins to feel less like an isolated pause, and more like the beginning of a larger test, one that extends beyond individuals and into the very structure of the monarchy itself. And as the king weighed his response, one thing became increasingly clear: the monarchy itself was being tested. Moments like these don't just fade away, they reshape the future. And within palace walls, the consequences of Sophie's decision are already being felt. What began as a controlled, silent gesture is now unfolding into something far more strategic, quietly influencing how power is perceived, distributed, and understood within the monarchy itself. Because institutions like this do not react loudly, they adjust subtly, and those subtle shifts often carry the greatest significance. In the days that followed, observers began to notice a pattern, not of open confrontation but of quiet alignment. The presence of traditionalist figures, those long associated with discipline, continuity, and a strict interpretation of royal duty, seemed to gain a new kind of weight. Not through declaration, but through positioning, through timing, through the careful reinforcement of values that have always defined the institution at its core. Figures like Prince William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, already seen as embodying that traditional framework, appeared increasingly central to the evolving narrative, their roles taking on added significance without a single word needing to be spoken. And alongside that rise came something else: distance. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but noticeable to those who watch closely. Interactions became more measured, appearances more deliberate. Natural ease that once defined certain dynamics began to feel more structured, as though every movement now carried an added layer of awareness. At the same time, the perception of authority within the firm itself started to shift. Authority in the monarchy has never been solely about titles, it is about influence, about who is listened to, who shapes decisions, and who quietly sets the tone for what comes next. And in the wake of Sophie's decision, that influence began to feel less centralized, more distributed among those aligned with preserving the institution's traditional foundations. Public interest, too, began to intensify, not through explicit headlines, but through a growing fascination with what was happening beneath the surface. Analysts and longtime observers started to speak, carefully but deliberately, about what many described as a quiet power recalibration. Not a takeover, not a rebellion, but a shift, a rebalancing of influence that reflects deeper currents within the monarchy itself. And at the center of that shift stands Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose role is now being viewed through a different lens. No longer just the steady, reliable figure operating within established expectations, but someone capable of making a calculated, symbolic move when it matters most. Her decision did not elevate her through force, it reframed her through intention. It suggested a level of awareness, of resolve, that cannot easily be dismissed. And that is what makes this moment so powerful. It didn't just challenge a single interaction, it subtly redefined how strength is expressed within the monarchy. Not through confrontation, but through precision. Not through noise, but through control. And as these changes continue to ripple outward, influencing perception both inside and outside the palace, one realization begins to take hold with increasing clarity. This was never just about who bowed to whom. It was about who holds influence, who shapes the future, how power evolves when the structure itself is quietly tested from within. But beyond power and protocol, this moment carries a deeper meaning, one that speaks to the very soul of the monarchy. In the end, it wasn't about a bow. It was about something far greater, a question of what the monarchy stands for and who gets to define it. Because when the noise fades, when the speculation settles, what remains is not the action itself but the meaning it carries. And in this case, that meaning reaches far beyond a single moment. A gesture withheld may seem small, almost insignificant to an outside observer, but within the structure of the monarchy, it becomes something else entirely: a symbol, a quiet declaration that speaks to deeper tensions between duty and personal conviction. And that is where this story finds its true weight. Because for generations, the monarchy has been built on the idea that personal feelings are secondary, that individual perspective must always yield to the stability of the institution. But what happens when that balance begins to shift, even slightly? What happens when someone who has long embodied that very principle chooses, in one controlled moment, to express something different? In the case of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, that choice now feels less like a deviation and more like a statement measured, deliberate, and deeply rooted in principle rather than impulse. It reflects a tension that has always existed beneath the surface of royal life, the quiet struggle between maintaining tradition and acknowledging personal truth. And in that struggle, there is no easy resolution. Because every step forward risks unsettling what has been carefully preserved, while every step back risks ignoring what has already changed. The monarchy now finds itself at that exact crossroads, caught between honoring the past and adapting to a future that refuses to remain static. Figures like Queen Camilla represent one part of that evolving story, while others, through their actions and decisions, begin to shape another. And as these paths intersect, the question of unity becomes more complex, more fragile, and far more significant than it may first appear. Because unity, within an institution like this, is not just about agreement, it is about perception. It is about the ability to present a cohesive front, even when internal dynamics are shifting in ways that cannot be easily reconciled. And moments like these test that ability in ways that cannot be ignored. Over time, this incident will not be remembered for its details, but for its implications. It will become part of a larger narrative, one that continues to unfold as the monarchy navigates its place in a changing world. A narrative where silence carries meaning, where restraint becomes expression, and where even the smallest actions can signal the beginning of something much larger. Because history within the royal family is not written only through grand events or public declarations, it is shaped just as powerfully by the quiet decisions, the controlled moments, and the unspoken understandings that ripple outward long after they occur. And as this story continues to evolve, one thing remains clear. The monarchy is not just preserving tradition, it is constantly redefining it, often in ways that are only fully understood with time. Because sometimes, the most powerful statements in royal history aren't spoken aloud, they're made in silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.